Well, good morning again, everyone. I believe everyone has tuned in that was in the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome again. My name is Elizabeth Darling. I'm the manager of membership and annual giving here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And welcome to the most recent edition of our member-only program, Curator Conversations. This one is all about our newest exhibition, Give Me Liberty, Virginia and the Forging of a Nation. So we have a special sneak peek before it opens to members and the public later this month with our Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs, Andy Talkov. So before I pass it over to him for the main program, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments throughout the program, please feel free to add that to the Q&A function of the Zoom or to the chat. We will have time at the end to answer as many questions as we can with Andy. And if you're having any technical issues, let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to assist you with that. All right, well, without further ado, I will pass it off to Andy Talkov.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce you a little bit to the work that we've been doing for over 2 years now to prepare this signature exhibition to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the United States. The exhibit is Give Me Liberty, Virginia and the Forging of a Nation. And it makes sense that given that in 1774, Virginia was the oldest and largest and most populous of Britain's American colonies, that the Virginia Museum of History and Culture take on the job of trying to explore Virginia's role in our creation story. So let's see if we can move on to the next slide. Now, we didn't take on this effort by ourselves. So Give Me Liberty is a signature project of the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. But what we were really excited about also was that we were able to partner with our colleagues down the road at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. So it seemed a logical partnership for our friends at JYF and us to work together to present this story. And so the exhibit will be on display from March 22nd, 2025 to January 4th, 2026 here at the VMHC. And then it'll be at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown from the 1st of July, 2026 to the 31st of January, 2027. And we're proud to say that this is really the first major exhibition that will open not only, in the Commonwealth to commemorate our founding and will really help to bring to life the years that lead up to and include the call for independence. So the exhibit includes more than 40 historical objects and a number of reproduction costumes. And is divided into 5 major sections. So you can see a theme here that each section is about action. So the 1774 portion of the exhibit speaks about revolutionary discourse and protests and calls to action. As we move into 1775 and the war begins, words turn to action. And then in 1776, Liberty in Action focuses on the meaning of liberty and the issuing of the Declaration of Independence. And then having sort of gone through that 250th anniversary through 1776 to 2026, we will also continue to talk about sort of what happens in Virginia after the 1776 year and how the war returns to Virginia and how Yorktown takes center stage in the final phases of the revolution. And then the exhibit concludes with a call to action that asks where we go from here. So for the rest of this program, what I thought I would do is focus on a few stories from the exhibit that highlight some key objects that you won't want to miss when you have a chance to come to visit the exhibit, either here at the VMHC or later at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. So the seeds of the American Revolution were sown in the decades prior to 1774, certainly in the decade prior to 1774. And as many of you know, the areas much of the area in North America was contested by major European powers, the British, the French, the Spanish. And by the 1750s, one of the key elements or key areas as it related to Virginia was the area that included modern-day Ohio and eastern Indiana, western Pennsylvania, and sort of northwestern, what became West Virginia. This was an area known as the Ohio Country, and of course, the Ohio Country had been an area that saw both French and English traders and some colonists moving in, but of course it was an area that was largely occupied by North America's indigenous cultures. And in 1754, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent a 22-year-old colonel by the name of George Washington to confront the French who claimed the area of the Ohio Country for France. So in a 1754 expedition, Washington moves out into the area that is currently occupied in southwestern Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh, and ambushes a small French force, killing its commander, and then was forced from the Ohio Country by the French counterattack, surrendering at Fort Necessity on, ironically, the 4th of July, 1754. The young colonel in these small engagements in southwestern Pennsylvania started a much more dramatic and larger scale war between the French and their indigenous allies and the British and their indigenous allies here in the United States, or in America, but also across the globe. So known as the French and Indian War here in America, the 7 Years' War in European history. George Washington, these events that surround George Washington long before he was commander of the Continental Army led to a major war that became the result of which became the impetus for revolution a decade later. Here you can see a quote by a British statesman, Horace Walpole, famously says, "A volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire." Now, this portrait by Charles Willson Peale was a portrait that was done of Washington in 1772, wearing the uniform that he wore while he was an aide during the French and Indian War to British General Braddock. So the following year after this engagement in 1754, Washington returned with General Braddock to the area around Pittsburgh, where the British were defeated by the French and their indigenous allies at the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. And during the commander, General Braddock, was mortally wounded during the battle. You can see him here at center. And Washington actually helps to save the army from dissolution and sort of organizes the retreat. So even though the battle had been a disaster for the British, Washington comes out sort of a hero from that event and becomes a fairly well-known military character for saving the army at the end of this disastrous military encounter. So one of the things that we're very excited about in this exhibition is that we've been able to partner with two other organizations. The portrait that I showed you earlier is part of the collection of Washington and Lee University. And we are very pleased to have been able to borrow that painting for the exhibition. And in the inset, you can see that in that portrait, Washington is wearing a sword, referred to as a small sword. Thanks to our friends at Mount Vernon, we were able to also display with this portrait a sword that is reportedly the sword that Washington carried during the French and Indian War while he was an aide to General Braddock. So obviously, when Peale drew the sword or painted the sword, he painted a sword that looked a little bit differently, but family history says that this is in fact the sword that Washington carried during those campaigns. So it's incredibly exciting for us to be able to pair these two objects together for people to see when they come to the exhibit. And to sort of get to the idea of really even early Virginia's role in the planting where the seeds of the revolution begin. Of course, the outcome of the French and Indian War gave the British control of the Ohio country. The British were victorious. Of course, that was done without the consent of the indigenous people that had long occupied that land. And as part of the treaty that ended the French Indian War, the King of England issued a proclamation in 1763 that prevented settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This proved to be a significant cause of resentment, particularly because many elite Virginians and others had invested in land west of the Appalachian Mountains, expecting that those would be open for settlement. And so this is one of the grievances that begins to sow the seeds of discontent between the colonies and the king. Also, because the British needed to station troops along the proclamation line to some degree prevent settlement beyond the line, those troops needed to be paid for. And so the very controversial Stamp Act and other taxes were issued on the colonists to try to pay for, in part, the stationing of troops here in the colonies. And of course, these early early tax protests, given the fact that the colonists believed that Parliament did not have the right to issue taxes without their consent, became a major factor in the growing discontent over the decade between the colonists and the mother country. So as we think about protest to action, many Virginians had for years been upset by those restrictions to westward expansion and taxes. And this all came to a head, at least sort of for our story, to our north, with the destruction of tens of thousands of pounds of tea by Bostonians in December of 1773. And as a result of the Boston Tea Party, as it came to become known, Britain instigated a series of punitive coercive acts, sometimes referred to as the Intolerable Acts, that included the Port of Boston. And this, of course, raised alarms for every colony. I mean, if Parliament and the King could close the Port of Boston, they could inflict that punishment on any of the colonies. And so in May of 1774, the Virginia House of Burgesses, which met in Williamsburg, the capital, led by Peyton Randolph, who you can see here on the left, resolved to observe a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in support of the people of Boston. Now, not only was there sympathy with the people of Boston and the destruction of private property and these rebellious actions, it enraged the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, who we'll talk more about in a few moments. But they also had, the House of Burgesses had assumed a role that the royal governor would have actually played in issuing such a day of humiliation and prayer. So it was like truly an insult. And so Dunmore dissolves the Virginia legislature and sends them home. Of course, many of the legislators remained in Williamsburg, met in the Raleigh Tavern, and issued a call for a general Congress of representatives from all of the British colonies to try to discuss what was happening in Boston and how the colonies could unite together, or at least think about uniting together to express their grievances. On the right, this really stunning reproduction of the Speaker's chair on loan from Colonial Williamsburg takes a prominent place in the exhibition. It not only evokes sort of the deferential and hierarchical nature of colonial society, but we can imagine that from a chair like this in Virginia's colonial capital, it was where political leaders like Peyton Randolph would have made the decisions that would, in this case, be a first step towards revolution, but also throughout the revolution. And so throughout 1774, Virginia leaders that included Patrick Henry in Hanover and George Washington and George Mason in Fairfax, and militia officers even at Fort Gower in the western regions of the colony, issued a number of resolves that expressed their concerns and discontent against British policies and demanded the full rights of English subjects. And at the time, it was through newspapers like the Virginia Gazette that you can see here, which was published in 1774 in Williamsburg by Clementina Rind, and broadsides and other printed materials that the ideas that were embodied in those resolves were spread. And it wasn't just to the people who subscribed to the newspaper. It was a conduit where people would read them aloud in community gatherings, in taverns. They were read to families in their parlors. And so it was the power of print that really helped to spread revolutionary ideas and was critical to the Patriots' efforts to form a nation. And it's also worth noting that these calls for freedom and liberty were also heard by an enslaved Black population who did not, who also wondered if any of that rhetoric would reflect what would happen to them as a result of what was becoming a growing conflict, and how that would affect the safety of their families and their loyalties. And so it was hearing these ideas among white Virginians that was then passed throughout the Black community as well. We were hoping, here's like a very behind the scenes image of the exhibit as it's being prepared downstairs as I speak. So in order to capture the drama of the printing culture and the rhetoric that was being expressed in taverns throughout the colonies, we've recreated a tavern and print shop. You can see the facade here. And our partnership with the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation will allow us to present a very dramatic opportunity for our guests to sort of see into and listen into the conversations that were happening in 1774 throughout the colonies in places like taverns, and the work that was being done in print shops to spread the word. So as we move into 1775 and tensions continue to increase, it would be impossible for us, I don't know where Patrick Henry went. It would be impossible for us to talk about an exhibit entitled Give Me Liberty without talking about Patrick Henry, who decided not to make an appearance in this slide. But Patrick Henry, of course, is known as a powerful orator and ardent patriot when he took the floor at Richmond St. John's Church on March 23rd, 1775, during the Second Virginia Convention. He had already served in the Virginia House of Burgesses for a decade. He had proposed resolutions attacking Parliament's claims of their authority to tax America. He helped establish committees of correspondence that opened the lines of communication among the governments of the various colonies. And in 1774, he actually went with 6 other delegates to Philadelphia to participate in the First Continental Congress, where he was easily recognized as one of the more radical members of the Virginia delegation. The delegates who attended the meeting at St. John's Church in 1775 were torn between hopes for peace and what seemed to be the growing possibility of armed conflict. And as you can see in this illustration, in this sort of imagined illustration, Patrick Henry had a flair for the dramatic. And according to one historian, he was known to push his spectacles up to the top of his wig when he was going to open up on an opponent in a debate. And a pair of his spectacles has been a part of the VMHC collection since the 1930s and has been on display here many times. What we're excited about for this exhibit is that we were also able to bring together another significant prop that was used by Patrick Henry during his famous March 1775 "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech. And that is this very unassuming whalebone paper cutter that is on loan from Patrick Henry's Red Hill. Some of my favorite objects in any exhibit are the ones that don't look all that important, but actually have stories that speak to an incredible history and association. So think about Patrick Henry standing in front of the Second Virginia Convention, almost 150 delegates. He gives his impassioned plea for the raising of armed troops in Virginia to defend ourselves against what seemed to be a growing chance of war against the crown. And I know that you're all very familiar with the words, but as Patrick Henry says, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of change and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty." And it was at that point that Patrick Henry took this six-inch paper cutter and wielded it like a dagger in the air. And then, as he said, "Or give me death," plunged it towards his chest as if it were a dagger. It's an incredibly dramatic moment, and an object that would seem to be very unassuming takes its place at the center of our American story. So I suppose you might be wondering, well, what makes that a paper cutter? So this whalebone piece has sort of not incredibly sharp edges, but edges that come together at a fine point. and it was generally used to open up the edge of published materials where the binding had not been cut by the publisher. So any well-read person in the 1700s would have had a paper cutter like this so that they could separate those folded pages. The use of the paper cutter in Henry's speech is really only published in 1969, so fairly recently, by Henry biographer Robert Mead. And at that time, it was misidentified. Only recently was it learned that this object was made of whalebone and not ivory, which had long been the belief that was the material here. But the story originated in a diary entry of Colonel William Fontaine II, who was a Henry descendant, who met with former President John Tyler in the 1800s, who related the story to him about the paper cutter from his father. So the Patrick Henry story of his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, because there was no recorded speech that had been put together from interviews with participants after the fact around 1800, and the story of even this object is one that was passed down from one generation to another. So Patrick Henry in March of 1775 is all too prescient. I'm sorry, let me go back. So in order to capture this incredibly dramatic moment, an audio-video program will allow audiences to see and hear the Second Virginia Convention and hear Patrick Henry's excerpts from Patrick Henry's dramatic speech. One of the objects in our collection that we've held for quite some time, which you can see in the inset image to the right, is this bell from St. John's Church, and oftentimes referred to, as a Liberty Bell. We've had this bell on display for many years too, but it was for this project that we were able to record the bell actually ringing. So as part of this audiovisual program, people will be called to it by the actual bell that gathered the delegates in 1775 at St. John's Church. So it's kind of an exciting opportunity to record a piece of history as well. So as I was saying, Patrick Henry couldn't have known this in March of 1775, but weeks later, again with our eyes to the north, escalating tensions in Massachusetts ultimately lead to a shooting conflict that began on April 19th at Lexington and Concord. And so Patrick Henry's call was very timely. A number of other events that surround the opening of the war around this time period in April of 1775 surround a character that is lesser known in the story of Revolution, and a key player who was largely responsible for making the decisions for which the Virginia Patriots would then react. So, of course, everything that happens in history is a choice. And so the choices of Virginia's royal governor, who I mentioned earlier, John Maury, the fourth Earl of Dunmore, were critical to the story of Virginia in these early days of the Revolution. So Lord Dunmore was born in Scotland. You can see him here at left, was a member of the House of Lords from 1761, and was appointed governor. He was having financial troubles, and so I guess one of the ways that you can resolve your financial troubles is to become a governor in the colonies. And so he was first appointed as governor of New York in 1770, but then in 1771 was moved to a much more prestigious governorship here in Virginia, despite the fact that he and his family particularly liked being in New York. So he arrived in Virginia in 1771, and his family, wife and children, arrived in Williamsburg in 1774. Lord Dunmore worked very hard to identify himself with the colony that he would lead, and became very popular among many uh, uh, white Virginians when he pressed Virginia's claims to the area in the Ohio country uh, for settlement. And so Lord Dunmore actually again dissolved the General Assembly in May of 1774 after they protested the coercive acts. But then Lord Dunmore's story moves west. Dunmore had considerable military experience and leads a force of Virginia militia into the west to attack the Shawnee Indians and their allies in the area around Pittsburgh and West Virginia. It culminates in a battle at Point Pleasant, which is now in West Virginia, which led to the giving up of land by the Shawnee, as a result. And so while Lord Dunmore was away prosecuting this war called Dunmore's War, oftentimes called Dunmore's War or Lord Dunmore's War, he was unable to prevent the election of delegates to the Second Continental Congress or from the Patriots from putting the colony on a posture of defense. And so in April, on April 21st, despite the fact that news from Lexington and Concord hadn't even arrived in Williamsburg, it wouldn't arrive until the 28th, Lord Dunmore takes a step to secure control of the colony. And one of the ways he does that is to seize the gunpowder that was in Williamsburg Gunpowder magazine. He does this on the pretense that there was a rumored slave revolt brewing, and there were rumors in multiple counties in Virginia of uprisings. But really, this was very much his reaction to the formation of all of these extra-legal military organizations that were being formed across the colony. The seizure of the gunpowder causes a major stir. There are protests in front of the governor's palace, which are quieted by his excuse that of these potential slave uprisings. But even further afield, from central Virginia, Patrick Henry starts to lead a militia group toward Williamsburg to confront the governor. It's high tension, and Lord Dunmore barricades the governor's palace and is said to have said that he once fought for Virginians, and by God, he will let them see that he can fight against them. Ultimately, Lord Dunmore has to flees Williamsburg in June and finds refuge in Hampton Roads. And as Lord Dunmore continues to try to regain control of Virginia, which becomes increasingly difficult as Patriot further increases, as Virginia Patriots become more organized. Dunmore takes an action which is not widely known. But in November, he proclaimed martial law and issues a proclamation that you can see here on the left. And as part of this proclamation, he offers freedom to indentured servants and enslaved Black people who are willing to bear arms for the king's troops. So in this effort of emancipation, which was largely done to try to save the colony, for the king, this ultimately just enrages white Virginians who, this feeds into their greatest fear of large groups of armed Black men fighting against them. And it actually pushes many people toward the Patriot cause who may have been on the fence. But Lord Dunmore does organize a regiment of about 300 soldiers called the Ethiopian Regiment, and many of them would wear these very plain smocks, which was sort of everyday clothing at the time, but emblazoned on the front, liberty to slaves. And the members of the Ethiopian Regiment were engaged in battle here in Virginia at a number of engagements. They were racked by a smallpox epidemic and then left the colony with the British in 1776. So this is an incredibly important part of the story of the early days of the Revolution, and shows the decisions that were made not only by white Virginians, but offers questions about where, for enslaved Virginians, where the best prospect of freedom or liberty might be. Is it with the British, who openly expressed that they were willing to do this? Is it with the Patriots, who are espousing liberty and freedom but continue to keep people in bondage? And so in Virginia, there are a number, is impossible for the incredibly large, 40% of the population, incredibly large Black population, to be unaffected by these events. And they were at a decision point as well. Ultimately, as I said, Lord Dunmore leaves Virginia in 1776, but he does actually try to come back in 1781 when the British return to Virginia in the late part of the war. And he doesn't. Yorktown happens before he's able to come, but Lord Dunmore continued throughout the war to promote an aggressive attempt to take back the colonies. So moving into 1776, one of the questions that I have is if you know what the Declaration of Independence looks like. Now, today, of course, there are many versions, and today, most people would say yes, because we live at a time when imagery is readily available through a number of devices. But for many people throughout much of American history, the reason that you know what the embossed version of the Declaration of Independence looks like is because of two men that you have probably never heard of, Peter Force and William Stone. So let me go back. The story of Virginians' role in the movement to become independent from Great Britain is well known. After a year of fighting in May of 1776, the Virginia Convention came together in Williamsburg and directed its delegation at the Continental Congress to propose independence. The convention also drafted a new constitution for the Commonwealth that included a Declaration of Rights, which was largely drafted by George Mason, that would protect individual liberties of free men from the government. And the language in our Declaration of Rights is very reminiscent of some of the language that Jefferson would adopt in the Declaration of Independence, such as all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, which means with the means of acquiring and possessing property. So flash forward to June 7th in Philadelphia. Richard Henry Lee from the Virginia delegation offers the Virginia Resolution, and Thomas Jefferson joins a committee of 5 men, including who you see here, Benjamin Franklin at the far left and John Adams of Massachusetts at the center, to draft a declaration of American independence. Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, his early drafts, on a desk like the one that you see here to the right. The exhibit, Give Me Liberty, will include not only this sort of imagined and fanciful painting um, by Ferris, which is in the VMHC collection, but also a reproduction of the desk that was made in the early 19th, a reproduction of the desk that Jefferson designed to write the Declaration on. But we're really excited to be able to show an object that is incredibly rare, which you'll recognize as the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration was adopted on July 4th, 1776. Flash forward to 1820. So with the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence approaching, Congress commissioned an engraver, Peter Stone, to produce a high-quality, life-size plate that would allow them to reproduce the original engrossed copy of the Declaration, which is now on display at the National Archives. And he spends 3 years doing this. And you can see in the slide on the right, here's, of course, John Hancock's signature, but you can also see the Virginia delegation that includes George Wythe and Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Jefferson below. Painstakingly recreated the signatures of every one of the signers. It was an amazing 3-year effort to create this plate. And a number of reproductions were made, about 200 official copies were made from that plate in the 1820s, in 1824. And they were distributed to former presidents and vice presidents, the Marquis de Lafayette, who at the same time was making a tour of the sort of a triumphal tour of the United States, where he was feted everywhere he went as a hero of the Revolution. State governors and the 3 surviving signers of the Declaration. So that would be John Adams, Charles Carroll, and Thomas Jefferson. So they were all given some of these 200 copies of the printing from this 1824 group. About 50 of those survive, printed on vellum. Now, between 1837 and 1853, historian Peter Force was producing a series of books, one of which you can see here, that was supposed to be an archive that recreated many of America's most famous documents. And it was a multi-volume effort. And among the documents that would be included in this set was a full-size copy of the Declaration of Independence that was printed from those original stone engraving plates. And so about 4,000 of those were printed. You can see here how it's tipped into the book and was folded so that the book could close. Thanks to our friends at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, who have recently acquired it's separate from the book, but one of these, what are generally known as these Peter Force copies of the Declaration. People will be able to see the Declaration as it looked when originally printed in this manner. So it was because of Peter Force and these and Stone and these amazing copies that were created, this amazing plate, that for many, many years, decades, generations, this is how people would know what the Declaration looked like. And so we don't have the original version, but this is as close as you can get, and a great, great piece of Americana. So as we wrap up, the exhibition does, as I said, speak to largely Virginia's military role in the 1780 and 1781 campaigns. the end of the war. And then, we as we come to the end of the exhibit, we think about the revolution as really the beginning and not an ending. The revolution created our nation, and started us on a course that we continue to this day. But the liberties and rights of all Americans were not included at the founding. And so, a civil war was, we fought a civil war in the mid 1800s, in the 1860s, to end slavery and expand rights to enslave Black people. Women struggled to have the right to vote. We fought for labor, laws that would control labor and add fairness to labor, and the recognition of indigenous people as citizens, and the full civil rights of African Americans and all Americans, and the expansion of marriage rights to all Americans. And so really the exhibit ultimately asks the question, what do we want to do next as part of this long revolutionary experiment, for which Virginia played such a significant role. So I hope that's a good teaser for some of the things you might be able to come and see at the exhibit. I do want to mention a couple of other items. We're actually so I mentioned that the exhibit will be on display here this year, and then next year at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. But I also want to mention that Give Me Liberty is coming to communities all around Virginia. So we have a traveling version of the show that includes a number of sort of panels, 10 double-sided panels that can be displayed at local libraries and community centers. We have more than 40 venues across the Commonwealth already signed up to accept this traveling exhibit. If you're going to do any traveling through Richmond International Airport, you'll be able to see it from July 2025 to July 2026. And if any of you are part of a group or would like to host this exhibit in your community, you can get more information by emailing my colleague Ajana Bradshaw at travelingexhibitions@virginiahistory.org. And lastly, for those who are interested in learning a lot more about the revolution, the VMHC just launched an amazing podcast called Revolution Revisited, which combines some of our very talented staff and incredible scholars of the Revolutionary era in conversation. So I encourage you to go to where you go to get podcasts and sign up to subscribe to Revolution Revisited, which is just an amazing way to continue learning about this incredible subject.
Thank you so much, Andy. I can't wait to see the final product when it's open to the public. And as a plug, just before we get to our Q&A, that the member preview, there are still spots available on Thursday, March 20th. So be sure to register online for that. It's free for members, but you do need to register. And then it will open to the public that Saturday, March 22nd. So we can't wait. All right, well, we have a few minutes left, so we're going to get to as many questions as we can. So Andy, I'll ask them and then you can do your best to answer. So you mentioned you had a photo image in there of the Boston Tea Party. So we had a question, did Virginians also toss tea into a river?
Yes. So Virginians held their own tea party in 1775 in the York River. And it was part of these sort of tea parties were part of a series of non-importation efforts that were that the First Continental Congress had agreed that all of the colonies would participate in. Tea was a good target for that. And I think that one of the really important things, sort of the symbolism of these tea parties in 1775, like here in Virginia, and the non-importation agreements, is that these were the first times that the colonies were working together um, in opposition to the policies of the king and parliament. So this was no small feat in order to get 13 colonies to agree to not import British goods. And so the way that they enforce that, because this is all sort of extra legal, was by these local committees that would enforce it. And so basically people were policing their neighbors about whether they were, and merchants about whether they were bringing tea in. So yes, along the York River, there was a small shipment of tea that was thrown overboard to prevent it from being sold in the area.
All right. And then we do have another question talking about Patrick Henry and his speech. Where will there be local commemorations of Patrick Henry's speech on the actual 250th anniversary? And I can take a portion of this question because I was actually at St. John's Church on a Virginia journey a week ago. So St. John's Church does do live reenactments of Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech. They do it throughout the summer, just generally. On the actual day of the speech, they are going to have programs. However, all those tickets are sold out. But I believe that there is a live stream that you can tune into on St. John's Church's website for that. So should be fun to tune in for that. All right, and then we have another.
I'll just
yes.
also mention that so the paper cutter that we have on display is actually going to be at that event on Sunday. So we will open the exhibit on Saturday, the 22nd, with Patrick Henry's paper cutter, and then we'll be passing it back to the people from Red Hill so that they can bring it to that event on Sunday, and then it will be back on display here on Monday.
Oh, that's wonderful. Getting everybody involved. And then another question here we've got, were all 200 copies of the stone engraving printed on parchment, or was it a split paper / parchment edition?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. My understanding is that they were printed on vellum, but I'm not an expert on those copies, so I can't say, but I could certainly find out.
Mm-hmm.
The force copies were not printed on vellum; those were printed on paper.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then another question. So you talked about Lord Dunmore and his offer to the enslaved population of Williamsburg and Virginia to fight for the British. Were there other actions like that in other colonies, or was that really unique to Lord Dunmore?
So that was extended to the British Army in other colonies as well. But it particularly struck those colonies that had large populations of enslaved people. So Virginia, Carolinas. What's interesting is that Lord Dunmore may have initiated it, but it is such a significant event that it makes it into the Declaration of Independence, right? That the British are trying to support like insurrection, among the people in the colonies.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then we do have a few more minutes here, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. For another question we've got, can it be determined the significance of the paper popping up from George Washington's pocket in the Washington and Lee portrait? So you highlighted the sword, but there was also a bit of paper in one of his pockets.
Yeah, so because he's in his colonial uniform, and it commemorates his participation in the French and Indian War. That piece of paper has order of battle written on the top of it. So an order of battle is essentially the roster of troops that you would have. It's sort of the organization of troops in a military force. And so again, it sort of speaks to his, his leadership, during a military event.
Okay. And then another question. So you mentioned that newspapers were critical to sharing the information of the Revolutionary period. Were literacy rates in the colonies higher than elsewhere, or because it's a little surprising that you would have, newspapers be so critical?
Yeah. Well, so literacy rates, I'm not exactly sure what the literacy rate was in the colonies. Um, but I think that what is critical about the printing of items is that you don't have to be able to read to be exposed to printed materials, right? So because they were read publicly and shared in public places where they were read aloud, um, there was opportunity for people to be able to be exposed to those ideas even without being able to to physically read them. So I think that that's like a key part of why the ability to print and disseminate it sort of exponentially grows, right? And so because of the way that people are able to share the information, you know, orally.
Okay. And then I think we've got room for one more question. So you mentioned several artifacts that are in the exhibition. I guess it's a good one to round us out. How did we at the VMHC and our partners at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, how did you all decide which artifacts made the cut?
Great question. Um, well, so in any exhibit, um, what in any exhibit, the story leads the selection of artifacts. So once the story had been decided, sort of focusing on 1774, 1775, 1776, um, and the key moments or events in those um, in those years were identified. Then the search for objects, really begins. One of the first things that we did is we searched through our catalog to just see what we had, right? So it does play on each other, right? The story leads, but sometimes the story is directed by a really good object that you have that you could show to explain a particular point or tell a really great story. So we went through our collection and identified items of significance that sort of matched the story that we wanted to tell. JYF did the same. And then, we spent a fair amount of time sort of looking for other places with known collections that might be able to help us tell the story. So, for instance, neither JYF or the VMHC had a particularly strong collection of soldier of soldier items, like personal items associated with soldiers. So we went to other collecting institutions, particularly we went to the National Park Service, and they were able to help us, help share some items. There's a really amazing shovel that was recovered from Yorktown, shovel head, and I know that doesn't seem like ooh, shovel, right? Like how exciting is that? But I think that what's really amazing about it is the condition. It's sort of an archaeological find. The condition it's in is amazing in that it's largely intact, but then there's also these pieces that have been corroded away over time that are just so delicate that like you don't even think it could hold together anymore, but it does. So it's kind of interesting for that reason too, that it survives at all, and just sort of the physical nature of it. It's kind of beautiful in its own way. So yeah, so we identified this story and then tried to find the best things that we could that would illustrate that story that had great associations with them.
Oh, I'll keep my eyes peeled for that shovel. All right. Well, we are at time. So thank you so much for all of our members who've tuned in for this program. A recording of it will be available later on today for future viewing and also to share with our wider membership. And a hearty thanks to Andrew Talkov, who's our Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs again. And we hope to see everyone at the museum when the exhibition opens. And for upcoming programs and events, we've got so many tied to Give Me Liberty and our 250th anniversary period. So please check out our website for all of that information. And we hope you all will have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.